And good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome to today's Research Talks webinar, the first in a three-part series exploring three pivotal studies in active travel from authors across 3 continents. My name is Lisa Martin, and I'm a director at Steer. Over the years, I've had the privilege of working on numerous active travel projects, collaborating with communities and policymakers to promote sustainable, people-friendly transportation solutions. Steer is excited to be partnering with the Active Travel Academy at the University of Westminster with the aim of empowering active travel practitioners by making academic research more accessible. One of the ways we're doing this is by hosting these sessions, which give you direct access to academic researchers and their findings. We're also supporting the development of reader-friendly lay summaries for each of the research papers featured in the series. These concise summaries will help you grasp key insights in just 10 minutes, far quicker than the hour or more it might take to navigate an 8,000 word academic paper. We're publishing these in English, French, Spanish, Chinese, and Arabic, again with accessibility in mind. Later today, you'll receive an email with the recording of this session and the lay summary to help you revisit and reflect on the discussion. So now I'd like to introduce our speakers for today's session. We're delighted to welcome Dr. Robert Egan, Research Fellow at Trinity College Dublin, who authored the report we're discussing today. His research explores why teenage boys may cycle more frequently than girls, how these behaviours persist into adulthood, sadly, and what can be done to address this gender disparity. We're also really pleased to have Jane Hackett, Sustainability Manager at Trinity College with us too, who commissioned the report. The research we'll be discussing today was conducted as part of the broader And She Cycles campaign. This went on to inform the development of the And She Cycles Ambassador Programme, which involved recruiting teenage girls from schools across Ireland to advocate for better conditions and better opportunities for teenage girls to cycle to school. We'll be playing a video to show you that work shortly. But first of all, I'm delighted to introduce Jane to tell us more about why she commissioned the research.
Thanks,
Jane.
Lisa. Thanks, Lisa. Lovely to be on this webinar this afternoon, and I hope you enjoy just a little bit of the work that we've done in the past. So David's going to help me kind of move through the slides. So I'm going to just talk about the background to this research and why we commissioned it. If you just go on to slide 2, David, just to give you a little bit of background, I am currently the Sustainability Manager in Trinity College, which is very broad remit. I cover sustainability across education, research, operations, and community engagement. And we're currently doing actually a transport study for the campus over this year, which is fantastic. But previously, I worked for almost 15 years as a program manager with a charity called An Taisce in Ireland, and my role there was around developing behaviour change programs to support active and sustainable travel to school. And I developed programs not only focusing on active travel, but also around climate action and also around infrastructural provision. A new program that came out of that was called the Safe Routes to School program, which some people might be interested in looking up. But the program that inspired this particular piece of research was a program called Green Schools Travel. And in the UK, you might know the Eco Schools program. So it's based on that program, which is a 7-step program where we work at trying to embed sustainability holistically within the school. So we were focused on working with primary and secondary school students to reduce the amount of cars traveling to school. And we worked with about 500,000 students in over a 10-year period. The project and programme was funded by the Department of Transport in Ireland. They recognised the fact that what we were doing through this kind of 7-step methodology was really engaging the school community, and it was really supporting the school to actually implement changes through a very practical action plan. So as part of this programme, we had a team of 30 staff who worked with schools in rural locations, urban locations, and with children from the ages of 5 to 18. So over 10 years, we had a great insight into the barriers to why people were continuing to drive to school. And just to give you the background, Traditionally, it's about 60% of all journeys to school in Ireland are by car, which is massive and has a huge impact on our towns and cities. And we're seeing about a 20% on average, car journey at the school journey is forming part of that wider kind of statistic. But if you go on to slide 3, David, that would be great. So as part of the travel program, we carried out like numerous interventions in schools annually, and things like you probably do in the UK, like walk on Wednesdays, bike parking, bike training for students, as well as for teachers. We looked at kind of the infrastructure around the front of the school. We developed a host of different interventions. And as we were funded by government, we obviously had to report back annually. So we undertook an awful lot of surveys to determine modal shift and if those interventions worked. Now, what we found was the interventions were definitely working, which is fantastic. And the last Central Statistics Office survey of Ireland in 2019 actually showed a 5% reduction in car journeys to primary schools. So that was fantastic. But what we did find on an annual basis when we surveyed the cohort of schools that were in the programme was that girls generally in primary schools, were equal to were cycled to the equal amount as boys. So there was a parity there. But the minute they went into secondary school, things started to change. We saw maybe first years girls continued to cycle, but by second and third year, they were dropping cycling. Now, they did stay in a kind of sustainable mode. They either swapped to walking or they went on the bus. But we were wondering, after putting so much investment into trying to get girls onto their bikes, why they were dropping out at such a short period of their life. We did make some general assumptions, and I'm sure those of you in the travel and active travel space are making the same assumptions. We asked, well, was it the helmet? Is it got to do with that? Is it to do with the infrastructure? Is it to do with the school uniform? And if we worked with the schools and decide, and the school said, well, that was a particular barrier, we try to actually support them in making changes. So we did work with schools to change their skirts, to offer trousers to their female students. We'd offer things like bike parking, and we delivered more and more workshops around things like helmet air. But still, we kept seeing a small number of girls cycling. And we know that we need to have a massive transformational change in our society over the next 5 years if we're really to tackle the climate crisis that we're facing. So we were trying to think of how will we get a huge number of girls back on their bikes? What is the barrier? Slide number 4 there. Thanks, Dave. So what we did, we recognized the fact that we needed to do something very different, and we needed to work with teenage girls to develop something different. So what we did was we worked with a number of teenage girls in schools to come up with a campaign, and then which is called Anti-Cycles. And you can see we used kind of a different approach as to how to advertise cycling to girls. And we didn't want to, make it pink and fluffy and feminine, overtly feminine. We wanted to kind of show it as just a very practical, ordinary thing to do. And out of this program, we also developed an ambassador program, which you can find out about online, which provides a platform for teenage girls to explore, understand, and address the barriers that are preventing them from cycling to school. So look, the research was fantastic. It's an extension of this campaign. Robbie was part of our team. He worked as a sustainable travel officer. He understood what the girls were facing. So we commissioned it to try and delve a little bit deeper in a way so that we could understand those invisible barriers facing teenage girls. And we didn't want to make any more assumptions, but we wanted to explore what are the societal and gender-based barriers in a more formal way. So the findings of the research, they didn't come as a surprise to us. Most of us on the team were women who cycled or cycle and have had similar experiences throughout our lives. So I suppose, I think Robbie will be able to give a really good overview of what the research findings were. But in the meantime, I think it's really important to hear from the students and hear a little bit about what they think. So I'll just ask for the video to be played. Thanks.
Hi, Robin.
Hi, how are you?
Good. Lovely to meet you.
You too.
So now I know this all might look a little bit intimidating.
I used to cycle a lot. In first year when I first started, I was so self-conscious about it.
I felt like everything was like stopping me from cycling to school.
Fear of being judged. Fear of being judged by people.
Loads of the lads cycle to school.
They just see girls as like dresses and skirts and makeup, and like boys as like bikes and like athletic stuff.
Peer pressure is literally everything.
This sounds really stupid, but I really do think the helmet is such a big part of it.
If you see a lad on a bike, it's not really different. You just think of it as, yeah. But like if you see a girl on a bike in her uniform or something, it's different.
I feel like you just need one person to do it.
There's something better than just like cycling and just seeing like the canal for me, like the whole like stretch along.
Instead of a 30-minute walk, it was like a 5-minute cycle.
I've completely got back into it.
The way you can push yourself and then after you just feel so great.
Like I don't like the fact that other girls would be like, oh, I would never get on a bike because of what they think, when like they won't ever get to experience like how it actually feels and stuff like that.
You're sweaty and you look awful, but like you just feel good about yourself.
Yesterday when I went for a cycle, I saw two of my old friends like on the road, and they're two boys, and like I saw them being like what's she doing on a bike? I didn't care. Like I gave them a big smile and waved.
Oh, people are gonna look at me, like people are gonna see me. I'm like, yeah.
You're your own person, you do you.
I think you build up this mental state of like, oh God, oh no, this lack of confidence in yourself that's probably associated with other things, and you're like, hold on, it's a bike.
Great. Thanks so much, Lisa and Jane. So great to get that overview as well of Tanchi Cycles campaign. And I was so delighted to be able to get involved with this research. So yeah, I will just take my notes out and then get going. Okay. Yeah, so just to provide a little bit of background into the research and that followed up on this this initial launch and development of the Anti Cycles campaign, where we tried to just look that little bit deeper, as Jane was saying, around what was going on with the cycling gender gap and what was going on for teenage girls and boys that created this phenomenon of cycling being seen as something that wasn't for girls and that was very deviant for girls to engage in. And the approach we used was called grounded theory, which is effectively a qualitative research method that you can use to develop an explanation of something that's going on in a particular area that starts off from a very open-ended and exploratory perspective. And then trying to analyze the data that we gathered, then we were influenced by some social theory that looks at the likes of gender performances, gender identities, and this proved really important and really useful then in trying to understand what the teenage girls and the teenage boys in the focus groups we carried out were telling us. And as Jane was saying, this was conducted as part of the Green Schools Travel within Green Schools Travel. And there was a range of active travel. There was a range of Green Schools travel officers who would engage in these focus groups across the country. So we got some really good national coverage, looking at places the likes of Limerick, Galway, Cork, and Dublin. And overall, we had about 15 semi-structured focus groups lasting usually up to 1 hour, with primarily teenage girls or girls only, to create a safe space to talk about what can be sensitive issues around cycling and the interactions that girls might get when they intend to go cycling. And then 2 were with boy-only groups and to try and understand the representations and understanding of cycling from the perspective of teenage boys. And generally, there were about 3 to 12 participants, an average of 7 overall. And as I said, there was a range of locations, and as well, there was a range of ages and years, because the understandings and perspectives in cycling could also change over time. As Jane was pointing out, this seeming turning point between primary and secondary was particularly notable. But also the perception of teenage girls who would be in the upper years and what they would be doing, and how that might affect the younger years who were joining and watching carefully. So we had from 13 to 18 years old, and then also from first year to sixth year. So what did we find? So overall, we found, in the words of one of the teenage girls who participated in the study, that cycling was overall conceived of as a boys thing, a social practice that was visibly practiced by boys. It was groups of boys, loads of lads, as one of the girls in the video just said there. So the visible practitioners were boys, but also it was something that was for boys. That was something that was natural or normal for boys, and something that was not for girls. And as Jane pointed out, in second level, you still do have high levels of sustainable transport, or you have some levels of sustainable transport from girls, even when it's transferring from primary to secondary. But you have this shift to walking and other kinds of modes, whereas for boys, you still have a reasonably high level of cycling relative to girls. Some of the participants talked about primary school, and this once again resonates with what Jane was saying around this idea that cycling, and these are the words of one of the participants, was natural for girls and boys. There was a place for girls and boys to engage in cycling. And of course, this could be a very kind of feminized cycling, these kinds of pink bikes or baskets or whatever else, or it could be this kind of more masculinized cycling where you have these sporty bikes or mountain bikes. But either way, there was this notion that cycling was something that was accessible, irrespective of gender. And then, as the participants talked about, then it seemed this transition to second level, also a period for a lot of people where puberty might be beginning and adolescence is starting. The notions of being feminine and what it was to be a teenage girl and how you were meant to behave as a teenage girl, and likewise being masculine and being a teenage boy, begin to emerge. And this seems to transform perceptions of cycling and perceptions of who can cycle and who can't and who should and who shouldn't. And as one participant described, that cycling just became the nature of boys. It was something that was natural. So you have this idea of this gender essence that seems to permeate then into cycling somehow and excludes teenage girls from engaging in it. And one of the big findings of the study then was what we termed incompatible femininity. This notion that dominant practices relating to femininity, relating to appropriately acting like a teenage girl in a way that conforms with ideals or standards or gender norms around this, appear to be very, very incompatible with the practice of cycling as it is currently experienced in Ireland at the moment. And to just provide a little bit of context, so Jane has obviously talked about the high levels of dropping and collecting to school by car. Cycling in Ireland, there's very little cycle networks. There might be some of the likes of Dublin and other major cities, but primarily it's a vehicular style of cycling. It would be a fast cycling culture because of this, and then also it would be one that requires a lot of boldness and assertiveness. So these kinds of things, as some other researchers on gender and cycling have pointed out, can be associated with masculinities and can be kind of stigmatized for women and girls to engage in. So it appears in the context of this kind of hostile, precarious cycling context of Ireland, achieving these ideals of femininity in adolescence and cycling in Ireland require for many very incompatible practices. And what were these particular practices that we found? Which can also be conceived of as a kind of norm or social norm. So the first of which was modesty, or in more normal language, covering up, as a lot of the teenage girls would talk about. So there could be the uniform, the skirts these were experienced by some as a socially mandatory thing to wear as a teenage girl. But in some schools, it was actually a mandatory thing to wear a skirt, and there would be an option for trousers. Not in all cases, but in many cases. And it was a case of trying to cycle with the skirt, concerns about the wind, concerns about the skirt blowing up, concerns about standing up on the bike, trying to get up a hill. But interestingly, even the position on the bike, if you were on a racer bike leaning forward, if you were using a bike with a high crossbar, there's very few step-through bikes in Ireland, they're not very normal, and that could also be a concern as well. And then, of course, the brute fact of you may possibly be the only girl cycling into school. You're going to be the first, as one of the girls talked about in the video. And this sense of visibility was very, very threatening to many of the teenage girls involved in the study, and acted as a deterrent. So that was one of the modesty. The second one then was beauty, or as some participants described as looking good or looking your best. So there was an idea that cycling on a bike was something that looked very awkward, looked very ugly, particularly with the helmet. Once again, as one of the girls in the video pointed out, it was seen as something that was just not in keeping with threshold level of feminine appearance, going to school or cycling around as a teenage girl more generally outside of school hours. So the helmet, the sweat, these particular kinds of feminine haircuts and hairstyles, generally long hair kept in a certain kind of way. This was all seen as very incompatible with cycling, especially in all weather conditions, and wearing a helmet. And then obviously the skirt then as well, as I said, this was something that was quite socially mandatory. And wearing trousers, even though it was an option for some of the teenage girls, that was seen as a very big transgression of how you're meant to appear in a particular school. So this was actually, even if the option was there, it was often something that would be very stigmatized if it was acted upon. So then third, we had the norm or the ideal of what we describe as continence, which has to do with regulating bodily processes, and this relates primarily with sweat and with body odor. None of the teenage girls mentioned menstruation in the focus groups, but I would imagine that this could be so taboo that way maybe it wasn't mentioned at all. There was this sense that the bodily boundaries are meant to be contained, and that sweating and body odor or smelling were completely unacceptable. So some of the teenage girls talked about it being something that's horrible, rank, or disgusting. These were the words used. And some also mentioned how this would not be pleased in teenage boys nearly to the same extent, that they would have these far more relaxed norms around sweat and body odor compared to teenage girls. And this was a really big problem when it was talking about cycling up hills or cycling with bags. So on first glance, some of the participants would talk about a not lacking the fitness to go to school and carrying various kinds of things. But probing a little deeper, what actually came out quite a bit was a concern with reaching a level of physical demand when cycling that would induce sweat, and especially when wearing a helmet. So these kinds of things were a major barrier as well, and this exists as argued before in a fast cycling culture where it's kind of expected that you go quite fast if you're occupying the road with motor vehicles. And then lastly, then caution or being careful. So this there was a lot of concern, amongst many of the teenage girl participants, those who cycled and those who didn't, with being very compliant with the rules of the road, knowing them very well, and also a concern with cycling on the pavement and feeling threatening to pedestrians or being given out to by pedestrians for doing so. And most of all, then concern with drivers, confronting drivers or having to deal with drivers who wouldn't respect their right to use public space. So this was incredibly contrasted with teenage boys in the study that we did include in the focus groups. So what we found then with focus groups with the teenage boys, as I said, there were two that focused on this. There was a few that were mixed. With teenage girls and boys, not many, but yeah, these two got probably the most depth out of the lot. We found that cycling was a means of actually performing or exemplifying masculine characteristics, and this was through the fact of actually cycling itself, just engaging in cycling. And some schools, this was a way of fitting in as a boy, so it was generally a collective as opposed to an individual practice. And as I mentioned earlier, for many teenage girls, you'd have to be the first, so you wouldn't necessarily be able to do it with your friends. And there were three main norms that seemed to relate to this, or three main ideals that were expressed or performed through cycling. And this was through a particular style of cycling as well. So one was athleticism or physical prowess, as other researchers have described it. And one particular male participant in one of the focus groups, described how seeing a teenage girl cycle could be seen as a kind of challenge, as something that would show up a guy, as he described. And some of the teenage girls who did cycle then described how they felt a sense of needing to prove themselves, engaging in this masculine practice of cycling by keeping pace with male cyclists, with some even being challenged to a race for simply occupying public space on a bicycle by males. Next then was audacity. So this related with the fact of this kind of vehicular precarious cycling. And no one mentioned the words, but I think a good word or synonym for this could be, in lay language, being ballsy or having balls. So you have the likes of road cycling, not wearing a helmet, even though, for example, your parents told you to wear one, cycling with no hands, engaging in wheelies. So some female participants talked about how boys would cycle past them and do wheelies, and this was a way of kind of showing off one's audacity or boldness. And then lastly, just engaging in fast athletic cycling as well, speeding down. So some participants described how the groups of teenage boys cycling to school were like Hell's Angels, for example, which is a kind of hyper-masculine representation of cycling. And then lastly, indifference. So showing the kind of active not caring. So showing this kind of emotional distance or coolness in the face of danger. So this related with a lack of concern for cars, a lack of awareness or a lack of perhaps performed awareness of the rules of the road. And this was seen as a kind of acceptable style of cycling. And if you were engaging in one that was more safety conscious, wearing a helmet, trying to cycle single file, this was seen. And of course, these particular safety measures can also be criticized. So I'm just saying, like a conventional notion of road safety. And yeah, these particular things then would be policed by other boys, for example, as something being too careful, being too cautious, being a chicken, for example, could be a word to be used. So then we get to the last major finding of the study. So we've talked a bit about the norms that often teenage girls are held to, the norms then around cycling that make it a performance or a way to exemplify or show off your masculine qualities. Gender regulation is what we found as the third major finding. And what we mean by this is that conformity with these particular norms for teenage girls and teenage boys were often policed. They were policed formally, for example, with the uniform codes that you see in schools, and then also informally by peers, including teenage girls themselves, to a greater extent teenage boys, then including parents and potentially as well school staff. And this was expressed by many participants as, for example, a fear of being looked at, usually with a kind of disciplinary style of gaze, a stigmatizing look, stared at, talked about, or gossiped, laughed at, or ridiculed, humiliated, and then heckled or harassed. So one participant talked about a particularly sinister incident where she was cycling home from school and she was chased by a group of shouting boys all the way to her door. And made her very afraid to go out cycling again, simply for the fact that she was a girl cycling. As well, there were homophobic slurs used in the case of cycling as a girl, and accusations then for some of being a man in a derogatory sense. And overall, then, helmet use was ridiculed if it was engaged in as a feminized style of cycling. And obviously, as I mentioned before, there were concerns around helmets being against a kind of feminine way of cycling, also because of the helmet hair and the awkward look of the helmet. And then finally, there was wearing trousers was something that was stigmatized as dressing like a boy. So it was very difficult to engage in cycling, to engage in a kind of self-consciously responsible form of cycling, but also engage in cycling in a way that was in clothing that was more suited, potentially more suited to often the high crossbar bikes that are more common in Ireland. But many teenage girls talked about this being the equivalent of a boy wearing a dress, that it was something that was very deviant, very stigmatized, very dangerous to engage in. So that brings me to some of the final points, what to do about this. So Jane has already talked about the Anti-Cycles campaign as a very innovative and creative and critical way of dealing with these entrenched problems around these kinds of gender norms, and how focusing on only one thing won't actually work. There's a need to think about what is going on broader. What is this process, and how can we interrupt it? How can we change it? And how can we challenge it? So one of the things we propose in our summary that you might get the chance to read is around making cycling more compatible. And this is something that Jane also points out to, and there have been efforts to do this where it's like feminizing cycling, maybe in a not very feminist style of feminizing it. But overall, you have much research that looks at, of course, the developing protected and direct cycle networks that enable this protected, this more social, more slower cycling. And as well, this can mean lower sweat cycling, and it can also mean, of course, helmet-free cycling. So these usual recommendations for improving cycling would absolutely benefit teenage girls, because it makes it easier to juggle these other norms that they have to tackle all of the time. But you can also take a critical approach, and I think the Anti-Cycles campaign in its inception and with the Ambassador program also incorporates this critical approach, which is about supporting teenage girls to politically challenge and institutionally challenge the entrenched culture of masculinized cycling, where it's seen as a boys thing, where it's policed as a boys thing. And more broadly, then, the restrictive norms that we've mentioned today around modesty, beauty, perspiration, and caution that limit the access, not just to this, but to a whole host of other different kinds of practices that are seen as masculine for teenage girls, where cycling is actually an effect of this in some ways. And then more broadly, providing opportunities for teenage girls to cycle collectively and create this safety in numbers and this kind of critical mass to make it normal and normalize this visibility of teenage girls occupying public roads and public space on bicycles. And then very last then is to target interventions that increase cycling participation amongst the older years of teenage girls in second level. So you could argue this could be a kind of trickle down femininity. Often a lot of the teenage girls talked about the ones in the lower years talked about how the ones in the higher years were more authoritative, they were higher social status, they were kind of looked up to, and they kind of take the lead and emulate this. So if you could target teenage girls in older years and help them and give them a platform to try and enhance the accessibility of cycling, this could help by trickling down to the lower years. So when they're joining this school, they might see it as a normal thing or something that to aspire to. But equally then, and possibly more importantly, is the transition between primary and secondary. As Jane mentioned, it's seen as quite normal, almost equally normal for boys and girls to cycle in primary school, and then entering this new context for many entering adolescence, it seems to change. It seems to be a turning point. So it seems to be a critical place to try and keep this cycling, keep this normalized image of cycling, and change it. And this could be related to many different kinds of factors, but we can see that with this particular study, the cultural ones are very big. But of course, you can look at this in a broader context, like with the recommendations we made around the protected and direct cycle networks. So they're the two areas, the two times or turning points for intervention. So with that, I will stop. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Robbie and Jane. I've gone from feeling very joyful and admiring those girls in the video for speaking so honestly and so candidly, to feeling quite somber, actually, Robbie, listening to what was a very long list of challenges and very diverse challenges, and it certainly feels like some are easier to overcome than others. So we're going to come to questions in a moment, and fantastic, I can see some questions coming into the chat right now. So I'm going to come back to those. Before I do, I just want to give you the details of our next webinar, which will explore the role of electric bikes in increasing women's access to cycling and physical activity. That will take place on Thursday, the 27th of February, 6 p.m. in the UK, 1 p.m. in New York, 10 a.m. if you're on the other coast of the United States in Los Angeles. We've tried to find a time that's accessible to everyone, not least our speaker, who's actually based in Auckland. So she'll be logging in from New Zealand to speak to us. So if you haven't yet registered, please look out for a follow-up email and join that. Hopefully that little advertisement gave you time to think of some more questions, but we've got some we can go to straight away. And Tom Cohen from the Active Travel Academy, I'm going to come to first. He's raised a question. Do locations where the gender balance in cycling is much better, example the Netherlands, offer additional lessons about how to respond to the issues you've described, Robbie?
Yes, so I think, yeah, well, first of all, you have that those fantastic cycle networks that are protected, that are far more social. You have a much slower cycling culture. I believe the average speed of cycling in the likes of the Netherlands is a good deal lower. It wouldn't be something that would be nearly as sweat-inducing. And obviously, you have that kind of compact development in a lot of Dutch cities as well, which helps that. So you have the reverse cycling gender gap in the Netherlands, which is a fantastic, fantastic achievement, and shows how the kind of spaces that we develop has a huge influence on that. And there is a lot of research as well looking at that, including the likes of Rachel Aldred's research around cycling and the different effects it can have based on age and gender. So yeah, there's that one aspect around the kind of built environment, and then you look at the likes of, I believe, Denmark. I might be mistaken in this, but you have these kinds of movements to create a more feminized cycling, or cultures of feminized cycling. And you have, I think, the cycle chic movement is an example of that. But that obviously comes with the baggage and the problems with feminizing cycling and having to make it into this kind of display of feminine beauty or appearance. So it appears that there are spaces where you have brilliant networks, but also you have some of these kind of feminized, if problematically or not, cultures of cycling that enable trip chaining and other kinds of things. And in Ireland, you don't really have those networks or those kinds of cultures. Would you like to comment on that, Jane, or do you have any thoughts?
No, I agree with what you're saying. I think we do in Ireland, we tend to look to the Netherlands and to places like Copenhagen, and if we're doing presentations, to local authorities, we would showcase these cities. And then I think there's a slight, we've slightly there's a bit of a backlash now, because people are like, that doesn't represent what we're facing right now. They're 50 years ahead of us in terms of their infrastructure provision and how their culture has adapted to that infrastructure. So I think we should look at a kind of situations that are more similar to ourselves, and where, cycling numbers are slightly higher for women, and see how we can replicate them. I think the Copenhagen cycling chic thing was bandied about a lot, and as a woman who cycled, I found it pretty offensive after a while, because it was a woman on a bike with a short skirt cycling around trying to emulate something that, most women who cycle didn't want to achieve. You have to be, in Ireland anyway, you have to be quite a strong person and to actually be a woman who cycles often. So I think we have to be careful of what examples we use, and we have to be very careful of the audience that we're showing the example to, because you have to really look at the audience and figure out what their barriers are, and then, talk to them about maybe what they're looking for. But yeah, we definitely need better infrastructure though, and maybe that's where we look to Copenhagen and Amsterdam.
Thank you both. A question now then from Paul Robertson in Cambridge, who points out there is better gender balance in cycling in Cambridge, as another UK case study we can take there. But he asks if university-aged young women cycle much in the study area, and if they do they act as role models? Robbie, you talked about the older year groups in the schools doing so.
Yeah, so you have, I believe at the moment from the 2022 census, you have 0.76% of girls between 13 and 18 cycling to school, compared to roughly 6% for boys. And that's gone up, I think, to closer to 7% for boys now. Sorry, no, that is now, I'll have a look now, actually. I have my stats here. Yes, it's the same percentage for boys, around 6% in university, it appears, and it's about 2% then for girls or young women. So it appears that in university there is a shift again, and actually there is a lot more cycling than there is there's less of a gender gap. There still is a big one, but it's less, which is quite interesting actually compared to it seems like second level has some kind of hold, and adolescence has some kind of hold that is broken then to some extent when moving into university.
Yeah. Okay. Back to schools then. A question from Alan Boyd, who asks if you think there are similarities with girls participating in sports, and therefore if there's scope for learning and maybe tackling some of the issues through more sport in schools.
Yeah, I think in Ireland, in the UK, you probably see the same stats, whereby age 14, you see a really sharp decline in the number of girls that are participating in sport. Now, over the last maybe 10 years, there's been a real push in Ireland to engage young girls in sport. We have a Gaelic Athletic Association, which looks at kind of Gaelic games and sport, and that has definitely seen a huge increase in the number of teenage girls that are staying in sport and are participating in team games. And I think that's because they've focused on things like they've changed often the kit, like teenage girls used to be going out and wearing white shorts, and the time of the month meant that they didn't want to play sport, often. So they've changed basic stuff like that. And they've also done an awful lot of advertising on TV and online, really showing like break the barrier and using young women to kind of engage in those campaigns. And I think those things have really, really worked. So, for example, my daughters play Gaelic football, and there's 70 15-year-olds in that squad. I'd say 10 years ago, you would have been lucky to get like one team out of it. So yeah, sport is a good one, but we need to look at how you overcome those barriers that Robbie, or maybe adapt those sports campaigns Unless it has to be less about like sports cycling, you know, and health and all of those kind of issues that if you're in the sports arena, you'd be focused on. But it might focus more on things like being a team, and a team could be me and my mate cycling to school in the morning, you know, and maybe taking some of those approaches. Robbie, do you have anything there?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, it seems like there's very similar processes going on with sport and this exclusion of young women from sport and this marginalization of young women in sport, and how it links with the less acceptability of sweat, the less acceptability of having athletic power and ability and that being celebrated. And you can see that even with with the like so in Ireland, obviously we have some real good representation with women's boxing. That offers a really good kind of counter femininity to these kinds of dominant ones you see in second level, I think. So there is a need to tackle this broader regulation that stops teenage girls from engaging in sport and keeping them on, while the gap just seems to grow then for a time. So yeah, exactly as Jane says. Yeah.
Okay, so just in our last few minutes, coming back to practitioners and what they can take away from this research. And Jane, I wanted to ask you that as someone who's commissioned this research, and you know there was a huge amount of detail seemed to come back from all of the work that Robbie did and described. What two things could you say sort of struck you the most that you've been able to do something with and feel like have made a difference to your work?
I suppose the one thing was that we put some resources into like an ambassador program, which worked with girls who, obviously these were girls who were already cycling in school, but the idea was that you were creating a team in the school who would like work with maybe incoming first years and support them as they moved through school to either start cycling or to keep cycling. So that was the idea of that. And that ambassador program has been running for 3 or 4 years now, and has seen, it has seen more and more girls participate, but we're not seeing the huge numbers. We're not seeing the impact of that program going up the chain to the older girls yet, but maybe the trickle down effect is working somewhere. And the other one thing is that I suppose one of the programs that I was involved in developing was an infrastructural program then, which was much more around stop thinking about the A to B journey, but think, I know there's a lot of engineers on this, on this call, and it's often about, the A to B, where are you getting to? But people were forgetting about, well, where do teenagers want to go often? Where do they want to connect up with? And are they going to the library, or is there another route that they take, maybe through an estate that's short, not necessarily shorter, but safer for them? So we were involved in developing a national infrastructural program looking at opportunities to create, improved cycle networks that hadn't been traditionally looked at, and engaging with teenage girls and like boys in the consultation process, So I think just being a little bit more ambitious about what that can look like in terms of infrastructure.
Yeah, really good points. Think about the people that are going to use this, not necessarily just the geography, right? Robbie, that question to you as someone who did all these focus groups, spoke to all of these people, is the one thing you would like anyone listening today to kind of take away and really see if they can bring forward in their work to help tackle this barrier?
Yeah, well, I guess just considering like a lot of the background of a lot of the attendees in local authorities, national authorities, and having jobs that involves transport planning for active travel. I think the notion of creating these connected, dense, protected cycle networks is very, very important, and that links up with these destinations. And one of the I suppose important points to make in relation to this gender gap. You have other research that looks at women in cycling and looks at like the problem of trip chaining, that women have more caring responsibilities And this can be reflected in mobility patterns and even more car use. I believe Ireland has more car use amongst women than men, for example. So with this, you have a trip to school, so it's not actually technically different. It's not necessarily gendered, the actual destinations that are being traveled. So yes, I think creating these networks, also ensuring that they can be networks that are social, that you can enable like cycling with, you can enable talking with, because a big part of this journey to school is it's not just a trip, it's actually a social event. And if you don't engage in it, you're missing out. You know, you're missing out in time with your friends, you're missing out in bonding. There could be a lot of important conversations, a lot of debriefs about school on it. So you have to create spaces that aren't just for getting A to B as fast as possible with the head down. It has to be a place where you can congregate, which is obviously a really big ask, but it is just something to be considered. And you have seen work as well, you know, in Dublin and other places where there have been very good protected networks being put in, but there is still that challenge about kids going to school using them and teenagers going to school using them because of this kind of social aspect of traveling together to school. So yes, that would be I think probably the most useful one for attendees in the audience. And obviously there's those broader questions of tackling those norms through the likes of ambassador programs, through the likes of group cycles, and anything that can build capacity and visibility of teenage girls cycling and cycling in a way that is, you know, actually like functional and fun, and isn't one that's like, you know, I suppose appeasing these norms that are stopping them from engaging in it.
Thank you. So many good ideas from both of you. I'm sure that's been really helpful and inspiring for some of those who've dialed in and joined us today. So I will wrap up here with 4 thank yous. First and most important, thank you very much, Robbie and Jane, for giving your time today to talk about where this research came from and what you found. I know people will have found that really helpful. The second thank you to the Active Travel Academy for the opportunity to have partnered with them on this and the ability to bring this research to more practitioners. And I need to give a thank you too to the Steer marketing team, Sarah and David in particular, who've made this cool and event happen today. And a final thank you to all of those of you who have dialed in and joined us, and for the questions. I know there's a few we haven't got to, I'm sorry, but we really appreciate your participation today. Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.